Before I start the video, I want to mention there are a few spoilers in the video. Not a lot, but the ending of the series is definitely spoiled. If you want to know the summarized version of what I think without the spoilers, here it is. I recommend watching the show if you like a character-driven drama with a lot of mystery elements in it. But don't expect every single mystery to be answered definitively in the end. But if you like a character-driven drama and are okay with some of its mysteries being glossed over or left up to interpretation, it's a great show. And that's my short, summarized version of what I think about the show after watching it again 20 years later. If you want to hear my more detailed review with some spoilers, that is starting now. I decided to rewatch Lost after 20 years. Well, 20 years from when it first started, not when it ended. The one thing I have to say up front here is that it doesn't matter if you watch the show now, and if it's your first time watching it or your second time watching it. No one is ever going to get the same experience as watching it back when it was first airing. Back then, whenever a new episode aired, people would be online after it and the next day talking about it in forums and formulating new ideas and theories about the island's mysteries and the story in general. Sites like Lostpedia, a wiki specifically for Lost, would be updated with the new details. But now, sites like Lostpedia aren't getting new updates. All the information on them for the story is current. The story is over, so there aren't new details to add or change. So watching the show now, you don't get the experience of discussing it with other fans right after a new episode, or reading articles on Lostpedia to try to see details you might have missed or forgotten about and come up with your own theories. Sure, maybe you could try to recreate the experience. Maybe you could start a forum online for people who haven't seen it and agree to do an episode a week and talk about each episode in the forum, and maybe you could even go back to the Wayback Machine and look for older versions from the Lostpedia from around the times the episodes originally aired, if it even still has archives of it from those years. But you wouldn't have a whole world of people talking about it. There might be Perspectives, your small online forum for people who haven't seen Lost yet don't have, just because there isn't a whole world of people talking about it now. So no matter how hard you try, you can never really recreate the same experience we had of watching Lost when it was first airing. But let's talk about the show now. Back when it was first airing, it was my favorite TV show, as it was a lot of other people at the time. People loved the show, discussing the show online after every episode and trying to figure out its mysteries. There were a lot of people who hated the ending of the show, and I wouldn't say I was among one of those who hated it, but I might admit to being slightly disappointed that there were some mysteries that were never really answered before the show ended. I think a lot of people who hated the ending maybe didn't understand the last season and the ending. Or maybe they were just really mad that some of their questions about the island weren't answered to their satisfaction. Or maybe both things. I understood the ending, and although I wished some of the mysteries and details that weren't answered definitively had been expounded on more before the series ended, I think one of the things you have to understand is the show isn't just a mystery show or a sci-fi show. And it is both of those things, and probably more so a character-driven drama more than anything else, but it's also a fantasy show. Not high fantasy like the Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia, but fantasy in the sense that there is a magical, supernatural element to the story. I understood that back then, and maybe even more so now after watching it through a second time. And I think maybe the problem for a lot of people the first time they watched the show is that they probably figured out there's a magical element to the story at some point, as it becomes pretty obvious eventually, but I think they still hoped for an explanation for the magical elements of the story. That's the thing, those magical elements of the story don't really get an explanation because they aren't science. They're magic. There's not a scientific explanation for a smoke monster. It's a supernatural thing. There isn't a scientific explanation for how a guy stops aging. It's a supernatural thing. There isn't a scientific explanation for how a cabin moves locations on its own. Those things occur by magic. And early on, it's maybe not clear if the island's mysteries are sci-fi or supernatural. So watching it through the first time, your expectation might be one thing when it's really the other. And I can see how that might be disappointing for some. And in some cases, certain plot points are just left unanswered, I think. One character near the end of the series even makes a comment that some questions only lead to more questions, which I think was a subtle way for the writers to tell the audience that not every little detail was going to be explained in the story. The first time, I was just along for the ride and just accepted the story as it progressed for what it was. The second time watching, I wouldn't say I liked it better, but maybe I understood some things a little better. For one, I knew going in there was going to be a fantasy element to the story, and, well, I already knew what was going to happen since I watched it before, but knowing there was a fantasy element to it this time, I didn't necessarily dwell on things I knew weren't going to have an explanation beyond magic. This time around, I might have noticed or appreciated some things I'm not sure if I noticed the first time around, though. There's religious undertones in the series, and it doesn't adhere to any one religion, but there are certainly Christian and Buddhist elements in the story, as well as a little bit of ancient Egyptian mythology. One Buddhist element I picked up on is when the island character, Richard Alpert, visits a young John Locke decades before he crashes on the island. Richard shows young Locke several items and asks him which one already belongs to him. This is clearly taken a page out of Tibetan Buddhism, because this is how they would select a new Dalai Lama when the previous one dies. Because they expect the Dalai Lama to reincarnate, they go in search of a young boy they think might be his reincarnation, and when they find who they think it might be, they show some items, including one that belonged to the previous Dalai Lama. If the boy chooses the right item, then they're able to determine if he's the next Dalai Lama. There are Christian elements too, which in some cases might pass as Jewish or Islamic elements too, but I think it's a bit more of a Christian perspective. You even have one character who is literally named Christian Shepherd, although he doesn't really live up to his name. He's dead in the show's present time, so most of his story is in flashbacks. He didn't always do the right thing and made some bad decisions in life, though I wouldn't say he was an outright evil character in life. He just had his issues like basically all of the other main characters in the show did. It's really what the show is about, I think. People dealing with life issues the best they can. Christian appears as a ghost on the island, but sometimes his appearances are the smoke monster in disguise. It's not always clear when it's him. He usually appears for his son Jack, sometimes other characters as well. Christian claims to be in the service of Jacob, the island's ancient protector, who has some godlike powers, though that was probably a lie. I think most of the time he's probably the smoke monster in disguise, who is trying to guide events to happen the way he wants them to happen. In some ways, I think the island is a bit like a microcosm of the world, or maybe the universe itself. The island has its own godlike character in Jacob, who has some godlike attributes, and a devil character in the Man in Black, who is the smoke monster, and can take the form of dead people on the island. He's made of smoke, so from an Islamic perspective, he might be a jinn, or as we would say in English, a genie. He might also represent like a god of death, or a mythical Greek Cerberus that guards the underworld, preventing the dead from leaving. The Man in Black himself is essentially imprisoned on the island and just wants to leave the island, but Jacob is like an island guardian who prevents him from leaving. So it's like God is still the God of the universe, but the island has a smaller version of this like biblical story of with a godlike person and a devil playing out on the island. The Man in Black has no faith in humanity and thinks the people who come to the island will just fight and corrupt the island. Jacob, like God, is faithful though and keeps bringing people to the island because he does have faith in humanity despite their shortcomings. Jacob keeps bringing people to the island and hoping for the best and says until the end comes, there can still be progress. Jacob has brought many people who failed to the island over the years, but he remains faithful anyway. It reminds me of stories from the Bible, where the devil wants to be God. Men commit sins, but as Peter says in his second epistle, God is long-suffering and does not wish for any to perish. In other words, it might seem like God has taken a long time to return and judge the world, but it's only because he keeps waiting because he hopes all will eventually accept his mercy and come to him. I think Jacob has a similar sentiment about bringing people to the island. The Man in Black thinks the people who come to the island will just fight and destroy things, but Jacob thinks they can do better, eventually. The Man in Black, much like the devil, does try to get people to follow him, though. He tries to convince people that Jacob is the bad one, and in some ways I feel he has some Gnostic vibes in the sense that He thinks he's opening the minds of the people on the island to some kind of truth, similar to how the serpent convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit because it would open her mind. In the Gnostic view, this was considered a good thing, as opposed to the Christian view that it was the sin who corrupted Adam and Eve. But the story doesn't strictly adhere to any one real-world religion. It just picks and chooses some elements from them and mixes them together. I'd say the relationship between Jacob and the man in black is a bit more like the view in Zoroastrianism than in Christianity or Judaism, in the sense that they are opposing forces with perhaps equal power, as opposed to the Christian perspective of God being supreme and the devil being a created being who fell from grace and opposes God because he wants to be the God people worship. Jacob isn't God. I wouldn't even say he's a perfect man, but he does have some godlike attributes. There's also Egyptian mythology mixed in a little bit. You see it in hieroglyphs around various places on the island. I suspect the blending of different faith elements is just the writer's attempt to try to appeal to a wide audience. In the end, basically the entire last season, the characters are in what were called flash sideways back in the day because it was like an alternate story playing out at the same time, as opposed to being some past or future events playing out in a flashback or flash forward. But the flash sideways stories are really in something like a purgatory. The characters are all already dead in them, and they are trying to resolve their issues before moving on to the light at the end. It's a Catholic element, and in the end, they all meet up again in a church so they can go to the light together. So ultimately, what do I think of the show after watching it all the way through twice? I think it still holds up well. It's a good character-driven drama with character growth, and there's always characters you're rooting for. And as much as I enjoyed watching it the first time around when there was all the buzz about it online and online fan theories being debated, I think it might actually be better to watch it now than it was back then. And that's just because I don't think any other show had ever been scrutinized in such detail prior to Lost. It wasn't the first show with a lot of mystery elements in it. Twin Peaks in the early 90s was mysterious too. That was before the internet and before HD TV. When Lost came out, people all over were talking about it online and going over every detail with a fine-tooth comb, and with HD and DVRs it was easy to rewind and pause things, and you could find screenshots easily online. I don't know if the writers were prepared for such detailed analysis by fans of every episode. Ultimately, I think a lot of things that fans thought might be important never really were. Sometimes an Apollo brand candy bar is just a candy bar. Just because it shows up in different scenes and different places doesn't mean it has any real significance to the story. When you can only watch one episode a week and then have to go months between seasons, you keep going back and looking at reviews and fan theories just to get your Lost fix. But now, in the present, you don't have to wait. All episodes are streaming, and you can just watch it all back to back. Never mind the fan theories, never mind little details us original fans overanalyze. You can just watch and then keep watching to find out what happens. As long as you watch and don't expect every little facet of the story to be explained and clarified in detail before the end of the series, it's a very enjoyable watch, and hopefully one that won't disappoint you in the end, at least not too much. Anyway, those are my thoughts on watching Lost again after 20 years. Thanks for listening.